Hey, welcome to the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute with your host, the alchemist of Indiana's Black Forest, Alan Bishop. Hey, this channel is all about home distilling and legal distilling. If you've got questions, reach out to us in the comments below, social media, or via bishopshomegrown@gmail.com. And don't forget to check out thealchemistcabinet.com. Hey guys, beautiful but hot Sunday here in Pekin, Indiana, and I'm about to go for my bike ride and get that out of the way because I'm going to focus on doing some writing on another project I've been working on, maybe even a little bit for the 2027 almanac, and then I'm going to break out one of the guitars and do a little fucking around with the guitar a little later on. So, but anyways, later this week I'll be making a little bit of blackberry wine for a very good friend of mine, family friend, who's helped me out tremendously over the years and hadn't made any wine for a while, so that'll be fun for me. I really enjoy making blackberry wine and raspberry wine and gooseberry. I just don't do it as much as I used to. I wouldn't call myself a professional winemaker the way I would a professional distiller, but I feel like I make pretty damn good country wines, and I don't drink them myself, but a lot of people come to me over the years to learn how to make wine, or for me to make wine for them in trade. And as you know, the world's getting stranger and stranger, and that trade and barter, that skill system set that you develop starts to have more and more value to it, you know, to be able to trade for what you don't have, something that we've sadly forgotten quite a bit of here in the United States. We got to keep it alive. So anyways, had a really good question come through and thought I'd go ahead and get into that here. It's just a single question video, and that's okay because it's a good one. So let's get into it. So hey Alan, it's your old pal here, your buddy from Stockholm, Sweden, and Stockholm is now ready for fruit season. Apple trees are full of fruit, plums are ripening, cherries and pears too. That's great. Not much fruit season here in southern Indiana this year. We had a huge season last year, and usually when the trees get loaded like they were last year, it takes them a few years to recover. In fact, the Fleaners were so loaded, this is the first year I've really seen them without production. Not only without production, but it really put some stressors on them, and some of them have had a rough year this year. They'll come out of it, but man, they were loaded such last year that you could not believe the amount of Fleener peaches that were harvested between 4 different parties that I had here. Myself, Thad, Hollows, Tyler Richardson, and another friend. But anyways, back to it. So part of the reason I got myself a still this winter was to make brandy for my own fruit. In my garden, I have 3 apple trees and 2 plum trees. The apples are not fully ready yet. They need another couple of weeks. But the whole week I've been collecting fallen fruit that didn't look too shabby. Today, Sunday, I will use the apple crusher and fruit press for the first time, and I've gotten some store-bought apples to add to the volume. I call it a test run to get my bearings right with the process. I will ferment whatever juice I get out of today's job. We'll see. However, I know you've done a few apple brandy batches in your life, that's for sure. I would like to ask you to give me and other viewers your expert tips on how to ferment and distill the cider. I've heard the brandy gets better if the cider gets a long time to mature. Is this something you also follow? The heads is where it's at, I've heard. What should I think about where it's at? I've heard, what should I think about when distilling? Low and slow. There's also a lot of methanol and fruit, so I guess it's a balancing act. What about the tails to avoid? Anything on how to make the cuts would be great. Normally I need to make 3 stripping runs to have enough for a spirit run, and I'm not sure I will be able to produce that much cider from my 3 trees. Do you think I should do a one and done, or get more apple juice from the store to get my volume I need? When I do a one and done, my starting ABV is about 58 to 60, so I bet it'll be smearing like crazy. Final question. Have you ever made liqueur from apple pomace? After watching videos from people making cider, I realized that the pomace is not much different from wine pomace. It must be possible to get some alcohol out of it by adding water and yeast, maybe topping it up with a little sugar, or do you think it's a waste? Looking forward to hear your thoughts and take part of your experience and wisdom. Awesome. Sunshine greetings from Stockholm, pal. Great questions. So yes, I've made a lot of apple brandy, and I'm happy to pass on what I know to you. So, nothing wrong with the method that you're going about with pressing and juicing, but to answer your pomace question as well as your general methodology question, so my preference has always been to make what's called apple mash brandy. So here in the Black Forest of southern Indiana, rarely was cider what was fermented. That would have been considered kind of an extra and extraneous step that actually took away some of the flavor. So the way that mash was made here was by actually just grinding the apples as fine as what you could get them. This is what I do at Old Homestead as well. Basically making them into applesauce is what I do. And then topping that up with water. Now you do as much as you can get in there, right, within logic, to where you don't have so many solids that you can't run it in the still, and it'll break down pretty well and pretty easily as long as you grind it up really, really fine. But then you top that up with water, and then if you were to want to, you could bump that with sugar. Of course, you know, being at home, you know, the sugar within reason, right? Because otherwise your ABV from either cider or from mash brandy is pretty low, maybe 1040, 1045 if you're real lucky. You might bump that up to 1060, 1065 with sugar or maple syrup, or, you know, whatever you got, honey, that sort of thing if you want to. That's my preferred method, and the reason for that is because then you get the flavor of the skins and everything, all those tannins, all that structure really coming across in that distillate, right? A really nice distillate with a really big backbone. There's certainly nothing wrong with making the cider, pressing the cider, etc. So you're asking about aging the cider and then distilling it. So that's something you'll see in Calvados in Normandy, and what they do often is they will ferment in large Fodder type barrels, huge barrels. They'll ferment that cider in, and those are used over and over and over again. So those barrels are constantly, you're not really getting maturity from the barrel itself, although you're getting some oxidization. You're not getting tannin from the barrel because the barrel's wore out. The tannin is actually coming from the previous pressings of apple cider that went into that barrel, and it's settled into that barrel, and then the next batch of cider comes in, pulls in some of that tannin, and often they will age it for up to a year. I don't find that to be necessary. Now in Palinka cultures and cultures of that sort, what you might find is that they'll wait until later in the season to actually make their mash, and then they actually let their mash ferment at least throughout the fall, over the winter, and into the spring. It finishes up in the spring. So, you know, it might fall asleep in the wintertime while it's real cold. That yeast might go dormant, but it'll kick back in the springtime, and that's another method of aging that cider. Now, when I was a kid, we did that a few times. I don't know that it was necessarily a part of like the planned process, but what we did is we had the old tobacco barn, and we would dig in empty whiskey barrels into the ground, into the dirt, you know, to where the rim was a couple inches above the dirt, because that soil is going to stay, you know, 50 something degrees over the winter time, and so it was never going to stop fermenting. It would just ferment really slow, and so some years it did go through the entire winter and didn't get distilled until sometimes fairly late in the spring, up past Easter time anyways. And that, I'm sure it does have a great effect. I'm positive that it does. I just, you know, for me nowadays, I don't have the kind of timing I'd like to have to do that with, etc. But it is something that you could consider. I don't mess with the pH at all. So pH of the apple wine and or the apple mash is what it is. It's typically going to fall somewhere between, let's say, like 3.5, maybe up to 4.2, 4.3, somewhere in there. Any good wine yeast or any yeast that's existing on the apples is going to do a fine job of fermenting that without messing with the pH whatsoever. You know, if you're going to go with commercial yeast, you know, go get you one that'll take a you know, fairly low pH, a wine yeast of some sort, EC1118, D45, 47, whatever it is. I can't remember what it's even called. It's been so long since I bought commercial yeast. Those will work just fine, or culture you some yeast off of those apples, or even let the apples work themselves. For cider, typically you're going to ferment that cold to make a brandy, so you're going to want to be in the 60s, maybe the mid 60s, maybe even down into the upper 50s if you can. For apple mash brandy, that's not anywhere near as important because a lot of the aromatics are actually in the skin of that apple. They're going to be retained during that fermentation. Typically those apple mash brandies for me, I'm going to finish those out in 3 to 5 days, maybe up to 7 days, and then I'm going to run them 100%. So I also, with apple mash brandy, my preference is to actually cook that mash and maybe even cook the apples down. Sometimes I will just take and you know, basically quarter or eighth the apples up and then throw them into boiling water and literally cook them down like you're gonna make apple butter. They'll get to a point where they just fall apart, where they just dissolve. That's my favorite version of the apple mash brandy that I do in particular. It also doesn't hurt if you have the ability and the room, and most people wouldn't have the room for this, but with any kind of fruit, I like to go through a double process. So a lot of people do cold, and there's nothing wrong with cold, but I like to really break everything down and be able to release it. So I'll freeze my fruit quite often, then I'll thaw it, and then I'll cook it. That breaks down the cell walls entirely, and you get all that flavor out of it. I would avoid using pectic enzyme. I've talked about this a million times. When you break down pectin, pectin becomes methanol. All you're really doing is releasing all that pectin into methanol, which is then in your spirit. It's going to cause hangovers. You know, you're not ever going to get rid of all of it. I hear people talk about during distillation with apple brandy, and this is a mistake that a lot of people make, that all the aroma and the flavor is in the heads. And I'm going to warn you that that is not true. That is a myth. So most of the time when people are doing that, it's because they don't have a good cider or a good mash to start with, a good aromatic mash or cider. And what they're doing is they're mistaking late heads, which on apple brandy can smell a lot like overripe red raspberry. It has a really appealing nose to it. They're mistaking that for the aroma of the apple brandy, and they're including that into their cut. If I were you, I wouldn't do that. Listen, if you want to make fruit schnapps, that's exactly how you make fruit schnapps. Single pass distillation, very little rectification whatsoever, if any rectification whatsoever, and include that raspberry note in there. Now you've got fruit schnapps, which is different than brandy. So the fruit schnapps you're going to treat more like a, you have a shot or two of it and have a few beers. Keep it diluted down out of your system, so you don't end up with a major hangover, but it's not something you're going to sit down and sip, nor do I think it's something that you probably enjoy setting down to sip on several glasses of it. It doesn't work that way. In terms of distillation, so I will always, with apple brandy, advocate for double pot still distillation for straight up apple brandy. One stripping done, fast and hard. One stripping run, fast and hard. One doubling run, where you're focusing more on the obtention temperature of the alcohol. So that's the actual temperature coming off your condenser. You want that temperature to be somewhere between 68 degrees and 72 degrees. Not colder than that, not hotter than that. You go colder than that, you're going to start imbuing the alcohol with a lot of those gases that would otherwise be vaporized, lost to the atmosphere. A lot of those compounds that you don't want in that brandy. You go too hot, you're going to start losing a lot of the aroma. 68 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit is about exactly where you want everything to be at during that distillation run. For me, with an apple brandy, I would rather run a worm than run a shell and tube or a Gatling gun style condenser, a Lebesgue, or anything of that nature. I really like a heavy apple brandy, and a worm will bring a heavy apple brandy across with some proper amount of umami or meatiness or whatever you want to call it being there in that finished product. I do like to obviously distill on the fruit where possible. I also prefer, when I'm making an apple brandy, to get extra apples and do one of two things. Either hang those apples in still somewhere or in a gin basket, or if you're running a thumper, you can throw them into the thumper, let that alcohol interact, that vapor interact with those fresh apples, pull some of that fresh apple aroma across. Now it will distill some water from those apples across too, and you'll lose some proof. If you're worried about that, then you get you some good dry apples and throw those in there. Now what's interesting about store-bought culinary apples, I've talked about this many times too, so Golden Delicious, as far as fermentation, that's about the best culinary apple there is to actually be able to make brandy out of. It makes an acceptable brandy. It's not a great brandy, it's a kind of middle of the road sort of thing, but it's a good baseline brandy to mix really good aromatic brandy into. But a lot of your modern apples, your things like Honey Crisp and things like that, I've talked about this several times. Although they taste good, they're a ball of water. They do not ferment well. They do okay if you cut them up and put them into a gin basket as an aromatic, or if you put them into a thumper as an aromatic, but they're not great. There's too much water. It'll also drop your proof while you're distilling a little bit because you're pulling some more of that water across. But if you buy a bunch of them and dehydrate them, then it's next level. Then it becomes a real aromatic botanical component you can use in an apple brandy distillation that really pulls a lot of those aromatics across. The other thing I like doing, I learned this from Wayne at Ozark Stillworks, and he wasn't doing it with apple brandy, but he was doing it with other things, or maybe it was apple brandy, I can't remember, but he was dehydrating apples and using those apple chips to actually do some maturation on. So instead of going into wood, he's going into a jar, packing that full of dehydrated apples, letting it set a couple weeks and macerate, pulling those off, gently expressing everything out of it, and using that as a maturation principle. I've been doing a lot of that. I really like that. I like the effects that come from that with the flavor and the aroma, the amping up of that apple flavor. To me is absolutely phenomenal. I like apple brandy in a toasted barrel. I like apple brandy in a charred barrel. I don't typically like apple brandy where the wood goes into the brandy and you're doing an extraction. For me, I want some level of tannin already built into that apple, which is what the apple mash is going to do, or what the long fermentation in a barrel is going to do for your cider. It's going to give it that tannic structure that distills across. And you start dropping wood into that, it gets funky real quick, becomes too tannic, overwhelms the apple entirely. So for me, depending on what you're going to do, are you going to make a white brandy, or are you going to make a mature brandy? If you're going to make a white brandy, I would suggest making very clean cuts. Get past that red raspberry entirely, 100% past that red raspberry. Let that go. You don't want it. Don't keep it. Make a tight cut when you know you're past that, the acetaldehyde and the ethyl acetate. You're getting down to your tails on a clear spirit, cut it a couple proof points above where you think you probably should. So in other words, you still smell a little apple, but there's, you know, a tiny little hint of funk. You should already cut it before you ever got to that tiny little bit of funk, right? If you're going into a barrel, on the other hand, what I would suggest is that as soon as you're done with that red raspberry, when you're on the very tail end of that red raspberry on that heads cut, go ahead and cut the hearts, because that stuff's going to mature out in the barrel. It's going to esterify in the barrel. It's going to become other flavors and aromas. You don't want a lot of it, a tiny little smidge of it. Keep going. When you get into your tails, wait until you get straight up funk on those tails. When you get that straight up funk, then cut over to your tails. You want a little bit of that again in the hearts so that you have some character. Otherwise, what's going to happen is that barrel, no matter how many times it's been used, etc., it's going to overwhelm all of that apple that's there. Then you might even monitor your tails, because when you get down to the mid 80 proofs or somewhere in there, you might pick up some stuff that you actually like. You might want to cut back in. Now, I wouldn't cut it back into your hearts. Separate it, and then you can decide how much of that do you want to blend back in. Does that give you any more apple characteristic that you might want? I always discard my heads completely from apple brandy. They never get rerun. They never go back into apple brandy. Use them to start fires, use them to char wood, use them to do whatever you want to do, but don't put them back in your apple brandy. They will throw off flavors to your apple brandy, even with repeated heat processing. Even though it breaks down acetaldehyde at the last state, I've never seen brandy heads do anything desirable that I would want to use, and that goes for all fruit, all types of brandy. With your tails, always keep your tails. Those tails are going to go back into the next doubling run, the next spirit run that you have. A lot of your flavor, a lot of your consistency, and a lot of your aroma is going to come from there. Or save those tails and do a separate run of those. Do a queen's cut. Take all those tails, redistill them, pull out the minute amount of hearts that are there, and that's probably going to be the best amount of apple brandy that you have. And when it's blended back in with the other good stuff that you have, it's really going to amplify that, or age it on its own. Then you have your own premium thing that's yours, right? The buddies get the other stuff that's good, but it ain't what you got in your jar, right? That's a separate thing. You might even consider going down into sweet water. So in other words, you get down to about 20 proof. That's about the end of your tails, where it's rational to drop to your tails before you start using more fuel than you're recovering alcohol. However, if you get down between, say, 15 and 10 proof, which is going to take a lot of fuel to get there, don't get me wrong, but if you can get down there, you might be able to recover some sweet water. Basically the essential oil, not really essential oil, but the hydrosol of the apple itself, right? That watery component with a lot of aroma, a lot of sweetness, a lot of flavor to it. If you can collect some of that, especially if I wouldn't do this with a white spirit now, with a brown spirit, but if you can collect some of that, and you can actually use that to proof down your spirit that's going to go into the cask or into the barrel for maturation, it will improve that spirit dramatically. Big thing is, when it comes down to proofing that apple brandy, take your time. You're not going to proof this in 24 hours. You're not going to proof it in 48 hours. You're not going to proof it in 1 week. You need to take a few weeks, and every time you go to proof, say it's a white spirit, drop it 5 proof points at a time, maybe 10. 10's probably pushing it. A lot more long chain fatty acids in apple than what there are in grain. And so therefore it has the ability and the want to saponify, or to create soap molecules and off flavors much quicker through proofing than what a whiskey would, for example. It might take you 3 or 4 weeks to actually proof it down. And this goes the same for the barrel. If you go into a barrel, go in at proof off of the still, put it in that barrel. How long are you going to let it set there, right? I would suggest a bad motivator barrel. If you've got one, you can get a hold of one, create one, whatever you want to do, or a 1030 barrel. As that thing evaporates over time, top it back up with water, but don't proof it all down in one solid go. For me, the only filtration I ever want done to any brandy is just enough to pull out any solids or anything like that would be there, but anything more than that, no, I don't think so. It just kills it. I like apple brandy, both white and aged at 100 proof. I also like very well matured, and I'm talking several years worth, 4, 6, 8 years, very well matured apple brandy at straight up cask strength, right? Whatever that ends up being. I did that a lot at Spirits of French Lick. I sold a lot of single barrels that were in the 130s and 140s range, and you ain't going to drink much of it because it will lay you on your ass, but it is delicious. And the concentration, when it hits that saliva in your mouth and it opens, the saliva becomes like water. It opens that spirit up in this major way, and it's just this huge, beautiful, graceful aroma of apple, right? whatever you do, whatever methods you use, whatever you take from me or you take from anybody else, the one thing I will tell you is that for me, brandy is the height of distillation. Other than absinthe, brandy is the height of distillation. What I mean by that is it's the thing that harkens back the hardest to where distillation comes from alchemy and from medicine. The one thing you want to do is every method you use, take the time to think about it, take the time to look at it, and think about it like this. The goal of brandy is to take you out of time and out of place, so that when you get ready to consume that brandy, let's say in January, snow on the ground, it's cold, everything's frozen, everything outside appears dead, you want to be able to grab that brandy, walk to the window, look out on that frozen landscape, take a drink of that brandy, and have one singular thing come to mind. Be reminded of time and place, which is right here, right now, underneath the apple tree as those apples were ripe. What did that smell like? What did you see? What did you feel? What did you hear? That's the essence of capturing a spirit. So that's my advice. I know that was a long-winded video for a single question, but that was a fucking excellent question. I love apple brandy. It needs to be respected. If there's anything that you need in terms of me clarifying what I just said, or any other questions that you have about apple brandy, I'm happy to answer those questions. As far as the yeast on the apples, by the way, so bear in mind that you can kind of put this in perspective for you. The brandy distillers here in the Black Forest of Southern Indiana, they never purchased yeast from brewers. They never purchased yeast from other distillers. They always got it from their apples. And this goes for any other fruit. When Prohibition hit here and the breweries all shut down and distilleries all shut down, they opened back up after Prohibition. They needed the yeast. You'll find stories of those guys going out and finding crab apples and using crab apples to make a yeast starter, even with their grain. So when you look at those apples that you have in your hand, you might notice there's a little bit of white film on them. That white biofilm is actually the yeast. Whatever yeast is on those wild apples, this doesn't go for store apples because they're usually, polished up, waxed, washed, all that shit. But for wild apples, you see that white film on them? That is a yeast that has co-evolved with that tree over the years to become its primary decomposer of fruit for the propagation of the species from seed into the future. If you can use that yeast, either make a starter of it if you're going to cook the apples and everything, take some that are not cooked and use that to make a good yeast starter, right? With some apple juice or some grain or however, it doesn't matter how you want to just get that yeast going, right? If you will use that yeast, you will find that, in my opinion, the flavor of that apple brandy will be 10 times better quantitatively than it will be with any purchased yeast or any other yeast that you can have access to, just based on its own merits. It will perform better, and it will do exactly what you want to do. It'll create a natural fermentation. In my opinion, spiritually, it's a much more lawful sort of thing. I know that's a bit esoteric for a lot of people on the channel, but I believe that very much matters when you are a true alchemist distiller. What is lawful versus what is legal, what is illicit, etc. So I would highly encourage you to use the yeast from the wild apples that you have there. And I hope you have a great apple season. I hope you make gallons upon gallons upon gallons upon gallons of apple brandy, brother, because that's the one spirit I think I just don't see any negative qualities with apple brandy, not from a physical perspective or a spiritual perspective. As long as it's made naturally, as long as it's made joyfully, as long as it's imbued with purpose and spirit, apple brandy is the best fucking thing that people could ever drink in this world if they're going to drink ardent spirits. So, all right, love y'all. Later.